Every empire that has ever collapsed followed the exact same seven-stage sequence. Rome took 4 centuries, the Ottoman Empire took 3, the British Raj collapsed in decades. Today, China sits at stage 5, and the United States is racing to catch up. This isn't opinion or prediction, this is documented history. The meetings happened, the policy shifts exist. The economic indicators are public record. We're watching 8 billion people navigate the same inevitable sequence that has toppled every dominant power in recorded history. Before we go through the pattern, you need to understand what imperial decline actually is. It's not military defeat or sudden revolution. It's a predictable economic and social deterioration that creates specific conditions in an exact order. Each stage makes the next stage inevitable. The 7-stage sequence operates like a machine. Feed it the right inputs, and it produces the same outputs every time. Different cultures, different centuries, identical progression. Let me show you how the machine works. Rome provides the clearest example because the process took long enough for historians to document every stage in detail. In 235 AD, the Roman Empire controlled 5 million square kilometers and 65 million people. The legions were undefeated, the roads connected 3 continents, and Roman currency was accepted from Britain to Persia. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire had ceased to exist. Not because of barbarians or Christianity or lead poisoning, because Rome followed the 7-stage sequence with mathematical precision. Stage 1 began in 235 AD when Emperor Severus Alexander was assassinated by his own troops. The Praetorian Guard had discovered they could make and unmake emperors for profit. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had 50 emperors. 45 were murdered or died in civil wars. The crisis of the 3rd century wasn't chaos, it was stage 1. Political authority becomes a commodity to be bought and sold, rather than an institution to be respected. Stage 2 followed immediately. To fund their civil wars, the emperors debased the currency. The silver denarius went from 85% silver under Marcus Aurelius to 5% silver under Gallienus. That's not inflation, that's currency destruction. When money becomes worthless, trade contracts to local barter systems. The massive Roman commercial network that had operated for 3 centuries disappeared in 50 years. Roads fell into disrepair because there was no currency stable enough to pay road crews. Stage 3 manifested as the massive migration period Romans called the barbarian invasions. The Goths, Vandals, and Franks weren't invading. They were fleeing economic collapse in their own territories caused by Roman currency debasement spreading throughout the trade network. Climate change from the late antique Little Ice Age made the situation worse, but the primary driver was economic. When the center cannot maintain currency stability, the periphery moves toward the center seeking resources. Stage 4 arrived when Emperor Diocletian imposed the edict on maximum prices in 301 AD. The Roman state tried to control inflation by fixing prices and wages across the entire empire. Merchants who charged more than the official price faced execution. The result was immediate and predictable. Goods disappeared from markets, black markets flourished, and producers stopped producing. Diocletian's price controls accelerated the economic collapse they were designed to prevent. Stage 5 began when Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 AD. This wasn't religious tolerance. This was the Roman state acknowledging it had lost the ideological authority to maintain social cohesion. Christianity provided an alternative organizing principle when Roman civic identity could no longer hold the empire together. The shift from civic duty to religious salvation marked the psychological end of Roman imperial identity. Stage 6 manifested as the division of the empire in 285 AD under Diocletian and formalized under Constantine. When a political system cannot govern effectively from the center, it fractures into smaller units. The Eastern and Western Roman empires were not a strategic choice. They were an admission that the imperial system had become ungovernable at scale. Stage 7 was the formal end. Romulus Augustulus abdicated in 476 AD, but the Western Roman Empire had already ceased to function years earlier. The barbarian kingdoms had been providing governmental services Roman institutions could no longer deliver. The end wasn't conquest, it was bureaucratic replacement. Check. Rome followed the 7-stage sequence perfectly. Political authority commodified, currency collapsed, migration pressures intensified, price controls implemented, ideological shift to alternative organizing principles, political fragmentation, formal systemic replacement. The Ottoman Empire compressed the same sequence into 150 years. In 1683, Ottoman forces besieged Vienna and controlled territory from Hungary to Yemen. By 1839, the empire had entered the Tanzimat period of desperate reform attempts. By 1922, the Ottoman Empire had been formally dissolved. Stage 1 occurred during the Tulip period from 1718 to 1730. Ottoman Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha became obsessed with European luxury goods and European-style court ceremonies. The Ottoman administrative class shifted from merit-based selection through the devshirme system to hereditary positions purchased by wealthy families. Political authority became a commodity traded among elites rather than earned through service. Stage 2 manifested as currency manipulation starting in the 1750s. The Ottoman government began debasing the silver akçe to fund military campaigns against Russia and Austria. By 1800, the akçe contained less than 30% of its original silver content. Ottoman merchants started demanding payment in foreign currencies. The empire that had maintained monetary stability for 4 centuries lost currency credibility in 50 years. Stage 3 appeared as massive population movements throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian and Romanian populations in Ottoman territories began organizing independence movements, but the underlying driver was economic displacement caused by currency debasement and administrative corruption. The Balkan Wars weren't ethnic conflicts. They were economic relocations accelerated by Ottoman fiscal collapse. Stage 4 arrived with the Tanzimat reforms beginning in 1839. The Ottoman government implemented sweeping economic controls designed to modernize the empire and compete with European powers. The reforms included fixed tax rates, standardized weights and measures, and regulated trade guilds. The reforms failed because they addressed symptoms rather than the underlying fiscal and administrative breakdown. Stage 5 occurred when the empire adopted European-style nationalism as an organizing principle. The Young Turk movement that took power in 1908 abandoned the traditional Ottoman millet system that had organized subjects by religion rather than ethnicity. Turkish nationalism replaced Islamic imperial identity as the primary source of legitimacy. The shift accelerated the independence movements in Arab territories that had previously been stable under the religious organizing system. Stage 6 was the formal fragmentation during World War I. The Ottoman Empire allied with Germany not from strategic choice, but from financial desperation. The empire owed massive debts to European banks and needed German financial support to avoid immediate bankruptcy. The military defeat was secondary to the financial collapse that had been developing for a century. Stage 7 came in 1922, when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk formally abolished the Sultanate and established the Republic of Turkey. The Ottoman system wasn't conquered. It was replaced by Turkish administrators who acknowledged that the imperial structure had become unworkable. Check. The Ottomans followed the identical 7-stage sequence. Political corruption, currency collapse, migration pressure, failed economic controls, ideological replacement, territorial fragmentation, systemic replacement. The British Raj compressed the sequence into less than 30 years. In 1920, the British Empire controlled 412 million people across 7 million square miles. British currency was the global reserve standard, and British administrative systems governed a quarter of the world's population. By 1947, the empire had fragmented into independent nations, and Britain had lost its status as a global power. Stage 1 occurred during World War I, when the British government abandoned the gold standard and began printing money to fund military operations. The political decision to prioritize short-term military financing over long-term monetary stability marked the shift from institutional governance to expedient management. Political authority became subordinated to immediate crisis response, rather than long-term systemic stability. Stage 2 manifested immediately as inflation and currency instability throughout the 1920s. The British pound lost international credibility when Britain could not return to the gold standard at pre-war exchange rates. British India experienced massive inflation that destroyed the purchasing power of local populations and made British manufactured goods unaffordable in colonial markets. Stage 3 appeared as independence movements throughout the empire, but the underlying driver was economic displacement. The Indian independence movement gained mass support not primarily from nationalism, but from economic hardship caused by British fiscal policies. Gandhi's Salt March in 1930 was fundamentally a protest against taxation and economic extraction rather than cultural oppression. Stage 4 came with the massive economic intervention during the Great Depression. The British government implemented currency controls, trade barriers, and economic planning mechanisms that abandoned the free trade principles that had built the empire. The Ottawa Conference of 1932 created imperial trade preferences that acknowledged Britain could no longer compete in open global markets. Stage 5 occurred when British administrators began adopting anti-imperial ideologies. The Labour Party that took power in 1945 was committed to decolonisation, not from moral principle, but from economic necessity. British officials acknowledged that maintaining the empire had become more expensive than profitable. The ideological shift from imperial mission to social democracy reflected the economic reality that Britain could no longer afford global dominance. Stage 6 was the rapid fragmentation between 1947 and 1960. India, Pakistan, Ceylon, Burma, Ghana, Nigeria, and dozens of other territories gained independence within 15 years. The speed of decolonization reflected British recognition that imperial administration had become financially impossible rather than politically sustainable. Stage 7 was the formal acknowledgement in 1967 when Britain devalued the pound and withdrew military forces from east of Suez. The British Empire hadn't been conquered by external enemies. It had been abandoned by British administrators who calculated that maintaining global commitments exceeded British economic capacity. Check. Britain followed the same 7-stage sequence. Crisis-driven governance, monetary instability, population displacement, economic intervention, ideological abandonment of imperial identity, rapid territorial fragmentation, systemic replacement by local administrators. Now let me show you the 7-stage decline pattern as a complete system. Start with Stage 1, political commodification. Political authority shifts from institutional service to personal enrichment. Officials use governmental power to generate private wealth rather than public benefit. Corruption becomes systematic rather than exceptional. The shift is measurable through rising wealth inequality among political officials, increasing cost of political campaigns, and declining public trust in institutions. At Stage 2, monetary instability, The government manipulates currency to fund immediate political needs rather than maintain long-term economic stability. Currency debasement, inflation, or manipulation becomes the primary fiscal tool. International confidence in the national currency declines. Trade partners begin demanding alternative payment methods. The shift is measurable through inflation rates, currency exchange volatility, and declining international reserves. Add stage 3, migration pressure. Population movements intensify as economic instability spreads from the political center to peripheral regions. Migration isn't random displacement. It follows economic gradients created by monetary manipulation and political corruption. Border regions experience the first and most severe impact. The shift is measurable through increasing migration flows, border incidents, and regional economic disparities. Add stage 4, economic intervention. The government implements price controls, trade restrictions, or economic planning to address symptoms of systemic breakdown. These interventions accelerate collapse by disrupting market mechanisms that had been functioning despite political and monetary problems. The interventions create shortages, black markets, and further economic distortion. The shift is measurable through increasing economic regulations, declining productivity, and expanding informal economy. Add stage 5, ideological replacement. The population abandons traditional organizing principles and adopts alternative ideologies that promise solutions to systemic breakdown. Religious movements, nationalism, socialism, or other ideological systems gain support not because they offer superior governance, but because they provide psychological alternatives to failed institutions. The shift is measurable through declining support for traditional political parties, rising support for radical alternatives, and increasing social polarization. Add stage 6, political fragmentation. The central government loses effective control over peripheral regions. Local authorities begin providing governmental services that central institutions can no longer deliver effectively. Fragmentation occurs gradually through increasing autonomy rather than dramatic secession. The shift is measurable through declining federal tax collection, increasing local authority, and reduced central government effectiveness. Add stage 7, systemic replacement. New administrative systems replace failed institutions through bureaucratic transition rather than violent revolution. The replacement occurs when alternative systems demonstrate greater effectiveness than existing institutions. The transition often appears peaceful because it formalizes changes that had already occurred practically. The shift is measurable through transfer of governmental functions, population allegiance, and international recognition. That's the 7-stage decline sequence. Political commodification enables monetary manipulation. Monetary manipulation creates migration pressure. Migration pressure triggers economic intervention. Economic intervention accelerates ideological replacement. Ideological replacement enables political fragmentation. Political fragmentation leads to systemic replacement. China today sits precisely at stage 5. Let me show you the evidence. Stage 1, political commodification. Check. The Chinese Communist Party has become a wealth generation mechanism for party officials rather than a governing institution serving public interest. Party membership is the primary path to business success in China. The Panama Papers revealed that relatives of Chinese political leaders control offshore assets worth hundreds of billions of dollars. President Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign has prosecuted over 1.5 million officials, indicating systematic rather than exceptional corruption. Stage 2, monetary manipulation. Check. The People's Bank of China has expanded the money supply by 800% since 1990. Chinese debt to GDP ratio has increased from 180% in 2008 to over 350% today. China manipulates currency exchange rates to maintain export competitiveness despite domestic inflation. International banks now require Chinese borrowers to provide collateral in foreign currencies rather than yuan. Stage 3. Migration pressure. Check. China faces massive internal migration as rural populations move towards cities seeking economic opportunities not available in agricultural regions affected by monetary policy. China also faces external migration pressure as North Korean refugees, Central Asian economic migrants and Southeast Asian populations seek access to Chinese economic opportunities. Border regions with Vietnam, Myanmar, and North Korea experience constant population pressure. Stage 4. Economic intervention. Check. China has implemented extensive price controls on food, energy and housing. The Chinese government directly manages steel production, coal mining and technology manufacturing through state-owned enterprises. China restricts capital outflows, manipulates stock market trading, and controls private business decisions through party committees embedded in corporate structures. Stage 5. Ideological replacement. This is where China sits today. Chinese nationalism has replaced communist ideology as the primary organizing principle for Chinese identity. The Chinese Communist Party now justifies its authority through promises of national greatness rather than class struggle. Chinese social media emphasizes cultural superiority, historical grievance, and military strength rather than socialist economics. The shift from international socialism to Chinese nationalism marks the psychological transition from imperial confidence to defensive identity. China has not yet entered stage 6, political fragmentation, but the conditions are developing. Hong Kong has already demonstrated reduced central authority. Taiwan operates as a de facto independent state, despite Chinese territorial claims. Xinjiang and Tibet require massive security operations to maintain central control. Regional economic disparities between coastal and interior provinces create conditions for increasing local autonomy. Stage 7, systemic replacement, remains years away, but the trajectory is clear. The Chinese system is following the identical sequence that toppled Rome, the Ottoman Empire, and the British Raj. The United States is racing to catch up. America sits between stages 3 and 4, accelerating towards stage 5. Political commodification. Check. Congress members consistently outperform professional investors in stock market returns, despite having access to the same public information. The average Congress member increases personal wealth by 15% annually while in office. Political campaigns require tens of millions of dollars, making political authority accessible primarily to candidates supported by wealthy donors. Monetary manipulation. Check. The Federal Reserve has expanded the money supply by 400% since 2008. U.S. national debt has increased from $10 trillion in 2008 to over $33 trillion today. The dollar maintains international reserve status, but China, Russia, and other nations are actively developing alternative payment systems to avoid dollar dependence. Migration pressure. Check. The U.S. southern border experiences constant migration pressure as economic instability in Central and South America drives population movements toward U.S. economic opportunities. Internal migration from high-cost coastal regions to interior states reflects economic displacement caused by monetary policy that inflates asset prices faster than wages. Economic intervention. Beginning stage 4. The U.S. government has implemented rent moratoriums, student loan forgiveness, and corporate bailouts that represent direct market intervention. The Biden administration is considering price controls on prescription drugs and has implemented industrial policy designed to control strategic manufacturing. The question isn't whether China and the United States will follow the seven-stage sequence. The question is how quickly they'll progress through the remaining stages and what the transition period will look like for the 8 billion people living through it. If China reaches stage 6 within the next decade, expect regional fragmentation along economic and cultural lines. Coastal provinces with international trade connections will seek greater autonomy from Beijing. Interior regions dependent on central government subsidies will experience economic crisis. The transition could be managed through gradual federalization, or it could manifest as rapid political breakdown. If the United States enters stage 5 during the next economic crisis, expect ideological replacement of traditional American political identity. American nationalism, socialism, or regional identity could replace the constitutional federalism that has organized American political life for 2 centuries. The shift would be measurable through declining support for federal institutions and rising support for alternative organizing principles. The 7-stage sequence operates like a machine. Feed it political corruption, monetary manipulation, and economic intervention, and it produces predictable results. Rome took 4 centuries, the Ottomans took 150 years, Britain took 30 years. Modern communication and financial systems could compress the timeline further, hold more cash in multiple currencies. The transition periods between stages create currency instability that destroys savings held in depreciating assets. Consider geographic diversification. Stage 6, fragmentation creates regional economic opportunities for people positioned in the right locations. Have a list of essential skills ready. Systemic replacement rewards people who can provide valuable services during administrative transitions. The 7-stage sequence isn't inevitable for individual people, even when it's inevitable for political systems. Position yourself to benefit from the transition rather than suffer from the breakdown. Subscribe to this channel because they're not going to teach you this in school. When stage 6 begins in China and the United States, you'll want to understand exactly how the sequence works and where you need to be positioned to navigate it successfully. The pattern is clear, the timeline is accelerating, and the next few years will determine which stage your country enters next.